manual there, and there should be some study questions that Darla has for you as well. And so so if we happen to get done earlier, if you guys want to get together and talk, if we're done before an hour, if you want to and maybe just do a little dialogue over those questions, it's really a good practice for small group dynamic. I used to be the pastor of small groups for about 15 years at my first church. And so I used to write all the curriculum for the small groups, the Bible studies and also the questions for the sermons that the pastor did and so forth. So there was classes where they could do it with interactive based on the sermon or based on book studies. So I've done a study on the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Revelation. There's just several. There's like 12 or 13 manuals I've written since 2000. And because I love studying the Word, I love getting into the Word, and I love making it presentable so people can really embrace it. I always jokingly tell people, being from West Virginia, if I understand it, anybody can understand it, because I try to simplify it as much as possible. But what I like about the Song of Solomon, this particular book, is that I was a counseling pastor for a number of years, and I had a lot of people coming in counseling. A lot of it was marriage, and I used to get so frustrated. I said, "Isn't there a book in the Bible that teaches us how to have healthy relationships? The steps towards getting married, the dating, the courtship, and all these different things that takes place." And I came across a book called The Divine Romance by Tommy Nelson. And he actually has a small group study on this. I use a lot of his material in this particular study. What makes mine a little bit different is that I give annotation of the verses. So I give you a commentary verse by verse all the way through. And so a lot of the practical parts, when I get into that, it comes from Tommy Nelson. And so that's another great resource. He also has a small group study. It's a video study on the Song of Solomon that you can also purchase and then use it as a group study as well. But because I'm a person of the Word, that's why I wanted to give people not just my opinion of what marriage and dating, all these things should be, but what does the Word say? And because as Christians, everything we do should be based upon the Word of God. And that's why I put this together in the format that you have. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with this 9 sessions altogether, and we'll work our way through them. We're not going to rush through it, but it's 9 sessions. Some will be a little bit longer than the others, and I'll explain that as we go along. So I'm going to open up with just the introduction here. The title for this book is called Solomon's Song of Songs, and it's really taken from the literal translation of the first 2 words of the Hebrew text in chapter 1, verse 1, meaning the greatest of all songs, which is a collection of ancient Hebrew love poems celebrating the experiences of a lover and his beloved as they taste the beauty, power, agony, and joys of human sexual love. Now, my presentation of this study will be based on its literal intent as a love song between a man and a woman, which I believe illustrates God's intended pattern for honorable and fruitful marriage. Now, some scholars believe that this was written by Solomon prior to his coronation as king. And we'll see in chapter 3, verse 11, for example, you see on his wedding day that his mother, Bathsheba, is placing a crown upon his head. And basically what that is telling is that it is a royal wedding, and that they have the blessings of the king and queen, but yet by her, Solomon is not king yet. David is bedridden. He hasn't passed away yet. And so, but only the high priest could do a coronation. So with Bathsheba putting the crown on his head, it's just simply their acknowledgement or their blessing that we bless that this is the future king of Israel. And so we see that this is prior to his coronation. So he's probably in his late teens or early 20s at this time here. And it's also in reference to the wife of his youth. And we know that his wife is Naamah, and Naamah is the mother of Rehoboam. And we see that in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 13. And the word Naamah actually means the pleasant one who is pleasant. And we also see that it's interesting that when we talk about Solomon, we always talk about he had 700 wives, he had 300 concubines, and that's in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 3. It says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And the reason he had so many wives and concubines was not that he had just a taste for women, But the reason was because he was so powerful and so revered and by the surrounding nations that the kings and rulers would say, let's give him our daughter in marriage. That way he won't attack us. He'll be family. And so he had all these wives and who had concubines with them, or their handmaidens, and they would come with him. But it's interesting, if he had all this many wives, and we know that polygamy was accepted back then, but it wasn't God's best, but it was accepted back in their culture at that time. But yet, it's interesting that the Bible mentions that he only had one son. If he had all these wives, Rehoboam was his only son, and he had 2 daughters. And the 2 daughters are mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 11 and verse 15. Now, if he had 700 wives and all these concubines, you think he'd populate all of Israel. And he'd be a tired man. But it's just, to me, it was just an interesting point of reference that the Bible only mentions he had 2 daughters and 1 son. And I believe that this is written in a manner to show us what are the steps to a healthy relationship. How do we resolve conflict and stay faithfully committed to our wives? And so I think this is why Solomon wrote this. Now, I do not believe that this book is strictly an allegory. And even though there's typological parallels that can be quoted whenever that's appropriate, I don't think it's exclusively an allegory. And basically, the allegory would show the love between Christ and his church, such as Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved his church and gave himself for it. Some scholars will say that Song of Solomon is an allegory of God's love for Israel. And so it could be, there could be portions of that could be used in that manner. But I believe that this is a literal approach to the relationship between a man and a woman. And here's the reasons why I don't accept the allegorical approach. Number one, there's nothing in the text that indicates that the author's intent was to allegorize. Secondly, the people, places, and experiences recorded seem to be real and not just a literary device. And thirdly, this little book does not just have a narrative character that we usually expect in allegories, but it has a progressive storyline. For example, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, this is in your table of content. If you want to look at that, you see how the flow of this book goes. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, deals with attraction. And I'll explain why that's important, because that's where we all start. We're attracted to a person, to the person of the opposite sex. There's something that God has wired us that way. And so we see this in the first 8 verses, attraction. And what does that mean? What do we look for in attraction? Then we see in chapter 1, verse 9 through chapter 2, verse 7, the dating, the principles of dating. And what does that look like? And what's the purpose of dating? We're going to look at this. And again, most of you are here have been married a while. Some maybe longer than I've been alive. But what's interesting that I think there's the material that you'll find in here is so appropriate that we can share it with our grandkids, with our kids, with other people, because there are things that occur when we don't do it right. And I'll talk about that as we get into the study. And then in chapter 2, verse 8 through chapter 3, verse 5, talks about courtship. And that's what we would refer to as the engagement period, that we're now engaged, because it's a deeper level of dating, and you're sharing some things with each other that you normally wouldn't have shared during the dating stage. Now you're at a place of deeper emotional commitment where you begin to share more of your heart with another. And that's what the courtship stage is. And then in chapter 3, verse 6 through 11, is the wedding day. And it talks, and so what are some things that we can encounter through the wedding day? There's some principles that whenever I officiate a wedding that I actually take from this. For example, when I do a wedding, I will challenge the attendance. I'll say something like this: it is a beautiful day that we're here for this wedding. We're gonna witness the union of this man and woman. And the thing that I want to remind you about, that everyone is here by invitation. You just didn't show up. You're not a wedding crasher. You're invited to be at this wedding. But you, the attendants, are the inner circle. When you hear the vows of this couple, your responsibility is to pray for them and hold them accountable to the vows they're going to make before God and the witnesses that are here. So that's how I start most of all my weddings, is by letting people know that we have a responsibility. It's not just a free meal and a dance, but we have a responsibility with each other. And then chapter 4 through chapter 5, verse 1, is the honeymoon, intimacy. Very graphic. That's why in Jewish culture, you're not allowed to read Song of Solomon until after you're 16 years of age, because it's very graphic. Now, I'm not going to get into all the graphics. We'll have to have all the windows and fans going if I do, but we won't do that. But it's very, very graphic as to how much they enjoy each other. And then it's interesting in chapter 5 and all of chapter 6, 2 chapters that deals with conflict and resolution. So I find that then marriage is about that. It's about working through things and just recognizing that God has brought us together. Divorce is not an option. We're going to find a way to plow through this and be the witness that God wants us to be. And then we look at chapter 7 through chapter 8, romance in our marriage. How do we keep romance in our marriage, and what does that look like? And then the last chapter, chapter 8, verses 5 through 14, is faithful commitment. So it's a progressive storyline of how do we develop a healthy relationship in marriage. So that's why I do not believe it is strictly an allegory. Now, let me read to you the first 8 verses. It says, "The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Because of the fragrance of your good ointments, your name is ointment poured forth. Therefore the virgins love you. Draw me away." And then the daughters of the Jerusalem. The main characters is the Shulamite woman, the daughters of the Jerusalem, and then Solomon, the king to be. It says, "We will be glad and rejoice in you. We will remember your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards. But my own vineyard I have not kept. Tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon." That's a key, at noon. "For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? If you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock and feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tents." Okay, so what I want to do is break verse by verse, kind of give a little commentary, and then we'll get into the practical applications of this. We see in verse 1, it's called the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Solomon himself wrote over 1,000 songs, according to 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32, as well as a number of psalms and proverbs. Now we know that the Song of Solomon was written by King Solomon probably in his early 20s. Now in the book of Proverbs, most of it was also written by Solomon. And Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs probably in his 40s, or between his 40s and maybe 50s and 60s. The time at the peak of his reign, a lot of wisdom. And I think it's interesting, and this is just my own personal perception. I think when David and Bathsheba, when they had their affair, and I think David really had a wake-up call, because he had lost Absalom, he had lost several of his sons because of the turmoil that took place in his household after this affair. And I think that when he lost the baby, and then God blessed them with Solomon, and then God began to tell him that Solomon would be your heir apparent, I believe there's so much reference in Proverbs of the father and son relationship. And I think really, from my own opinion, let me say that, my own opinion, that a lot of the Proverbs was written of Solomon recalling the words that David gave him, because David learned from the school of hard knocks, and he was called a man after God's own heart. So when you read a lot of the early parts of Proverbs, even about the adulterous woman and about how father and son should react to each other, it seems like it's coming from wisdom of a man who had experienced some of these things. And so I see that. So I think Proverbs is a lot of a compilation of that dialogue between David and Solomon as he was growing up. Because in Jewish culture, the fathers were to instruct their children daily. Not only the first 5 books of the law, or 5 books of Moses, but just principles of life in general. And I think there was a lot of that going on. And then we get into the book of Ecclesiastes, which came at the latter part of Solomon's life. And Ecclesiastes shows how David began to be influenced by these extra wives and concubines that he had, and his heart began to pursue and follow after other gods. And he was even beginning to question his relationship with God. In fact, in the book of Ecclesiastes is the only place where in the Bible where God is not addressed as a covenant-keeping God, but as a creator God. And so Solomon had kind of drifted away. But at the conclusion, he comes back. I have a whole study on that, and that's generally a study that I do at the beginning of the year. And Lord willing, I'm here, I may do that for you. It's about 12 studies, so I may do that in January, take this the next 12 weeks of the Lord. So I'm already thinking about what am I going to do because I got my sermons laid out for the end of this year already. So thinking what I do now to launch into next year if a new pastor is not found by then. So I'm already thinking ahead to take care of you guys. So, so we see here in verse 2, and this is interesting, and note in verse 2, it's the Shulamite girl who speaks. She says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for his love is better than wine." And so we see here that this book begins with the girl expressing her deep desire for physical expression of love. But it's also very significant that the girl speaks first and considers herself of equal stature with the male. And in fact, the Shulamite woman, which I believe is Naamah, that she does most of the talking. Now, some things haven't changed, have they, guys? Watch how you nod your head. But she does most of the talking in the whole book of Song of Solomon. But she views herself as an equal, and even though Solomon's going to be king. But she, just by how she interacts with him. And then she says in verse 3, "Because of the fragrance of your good ointments, your name is ointment poured forth. Therefore, the virgins love you." And what she's saying here is that Solomon is very physically delightful. And and it's also something to note that men back in those days did not bathe regularly. Instead, they would rub fragrant oil over their body to keep their skin from drying out due to the climate. But it says also your name. A person's name is also always associated with the person's character. You've heard people use the expression, they have a good name, which are saying that it's a family of character, family of integrity. And so it's speaking that his character is pure, it's holy. He has a good relationship with his God. It says, "Therefore the virgins love you." He's very popular. People seem to like Solomon. And then in verse 4, she says, "Draw me away." Now, she would consider herself privileged to be his wife. It says, "We will run after you. The king has brought me into his chambers." And this speaks of the intimacy of his home. The reference of king infers a royal romance that's taking place. The last part of verse 4, "We will be glad and rejoice in you. We will remember your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you." And the speakers here are the daughters of Jerusalem, actually are probably friends of the maiden. And they declare that Solomon is worthy. That's something to note. What do your friends say about the person that you're attracted to? We get into middle school and high school, you get your little cliques, and they're always talking about, "Oh, there's about so-and-so." And they're comparing notes. What do you know about this person? "Oh, he's so cute," or "She's really pretty." And what do you know about them? What do you know about their family? And here we're seeing that things have not changed. And they declare Solomon is worthy. He's good ground. He's a person of integrity, a person of good character. Verse 5, she says, "I am dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon." See, after the man's character is highlighted, now the woman's. She is physically attractive, but her character surpasses looks. That's something we got to remember. Remember that looks will deceive and they will decline. I've actually told couples on their wedding day, that's why maybe I don't get a lot of wedding invitations anymore. I said, take a look at each other. This is the best you're going to look. It's from downhill after that. They spend all this money and all this time to look this good. After that, it goes down. Not always, but they just try to lighten it up because a lot of times the guys are so nervous and they're weaving back and forth. I had one guy that is a doctor, and they had determined they were going to kiss through the whole dating period. They were going to kiss until they were pronounced husband and wife. That's just their own personal preference. And so he was almost passing out. And I said, listen, you fall down and pass out, I'm not putting my lips on you and give you mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And I said, she can't do it because you're not married yet. So you need to stand still and just be with us here. So anyway, it's interesting to just know how she begins to describe herself. And then says, do not look upon me because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me. And what this is saying is that she's hardworking, she's submissive, she's a servant. She says, my mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards. And so it shows that she's responsible and she's obedient to authority. That's part of the culture back then. So instead of saying, I'm not going to do that, you do that, women were considered, second-class citizens at this time. So they didn't have the rights that Christ gave them in the Gospels. And so then we see here that she says, but my own vineyard I've not kept. And she's speaking of her physical appearance. She's been working so hard, she hasn't considered taking care of herself, because women were more highly esteemed if they were real white. Now, we got tanning beds and tanning salons. We go down south to tan and to look tan. But back in biblical days, a woman who was tan was considered more like a servant because she was out working. But the ones who were white and stayed inside were pampered and considered privileged, so to speak. In verse 7 it says, tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. And so it's interesting, she says at noon, she is morally upright and committed to purity. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? No, she longs to be with him, but will only meet him in the day, in daytime, in public, and not as a veiled prostitute. And in verse 8, if you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock and feed your little goats beside the shepherd's tent. Now she's encouraged here to seek such a man by the daughters of Jerusalem. And that's her friends, her attendants, and they're encouraging her. Now let me share with you some practical information about attraction. Now attraction is both permissible and it's also desirable. And this is generally where relationships begin, is this mutual attraction. There's something that you saw about your mate that you're with that attracted you to them. Working up the nerve to ask them out and so forth. I know for the first time I kissed my wife, Jean, first time I kissed her was the day I proposed to her. We had dated, we had gone out, and before I was a Christian, was more sexually active than I should have been. I will say that. And I knew myself. But I wanted her to be so valued as a treasure that I had vowed that I was not going to touch her until we were married. We were both 23, and we were I was attracted to her. But yet, I also knew she came from a Catholic family. And I also knew that her family didn't really like me too well because I wasn't Catholic. And so I was so nervous the day I proposed. I actually had to write it out in a letter because we went to Pizza Hut of all romantic places in Sheboygan, and I walked over to the jukebox at the time and I played a Dan Fogelberg song. I'm Mr. Romantic. I had this all planned out how I was going to do it, and it's called "Longer Than." Remember the song Dan Fogelberg, "Longer Than This"? I have loved you longer than. It just goes on and on. It's a very romantic song. And then she's looking kind of bewildered. We had just come from a movie. And I said, I've been wanting to tell you how I feel about you. And I'm just really don't know how to say it. So I wrote it out. So I gave her the letter. And then I had her read it. And she looked up. And she felt the same way. And so this was in January of 1981. And we got married in July of 1981. And so we've been married for 39 years. And but I was attracted to her, and I was attracted to her physically. I thought she was very attractive. She had a great smile, and she looked good to me. And at the time, my bubble wasn't as big back then as I am now. I was a size 28 in waist when I got married. I weighed 114 pounds. I'm not going to tell you what I weigh now, but it's more than that. And but we were just attracted to each other, but more so than the physical. I mean, that's the first. There's two tiers of attraction. First is the physical, the outward. That's automatic. You go, man, there's something about that person I really like. Man, she's really pretty, And I like her energy. I like her, just everything about her. She's just very, to me, just gorgeous. And that's the first level of attraction that most people experience. It's the physical, because it encompasses all the senses. And in fact, the first 3 verses of the Song of Solomon, we find that the woman herself is very physically attracted to Solomon. She wants to kiss him, and she's intoxicated by him. And so that doesn't need a lot of explanation about the part of being physically attracted. I mean, that's really what caught your eye. If you were to reminisce back, and if I was to have a conversation with you, I would say, what's the first thing you notice about your mate? You know, and you would tell me there's something that you saw about this person that really caught your eye. And for us men, we're more visual, so that's probably we saw someone that looked really good to us. We just went, how can I get to know this person? But the second one is probably the most important, is the character, or the inward part. Physical is outward, but now it's the character and the spirituality inward. This is really what attracted Jean, what she found attractive in me. Because I was so zealous when I got saved, I should have been locked up for 6 months. I was dangerous. And because I got radically saved. I was radically saved. I was self-destructive. I didn't care if I lived or died. But when I got saved in my senior year in high school in West Virginia, I started Bible studies. I started preaching. I started studying right away. I just had such a thirst for the Word of God. Because for the first time in my life, I began to feel loved and validated. The weight of sin and neglect was removed off of my shoulders. And I felt that someone really cared about me and believed in me. And then when Jean saw me, I was doing Bible studies in UW Oshkosh. We were going to college in Oshkosh. And she saw, and here's this radical, long-haired guy. As you can tell, I had long hair back then, but I had long hair back then. I wore a T-shirt, wanted Jesus Christ. Looked like a wanted poster, wanted Jesus Christ. You have a lot to, this Pepsi T-shirt, you have a lot to live. Jesus has a lot to give. All these Christian slogans that you saw on these shirts. Some where I'm swimming around campus and I'm preaching to everybody that will listen, even those who wouldn't listen. I would preach to them. But Jean thought, this guy really loves God. And she had just gotten saved, and she goes, this guy, and then her brother and I became roommates, and we didn't like each other too much. Well, I liked her, but she didn't like me. So that was that was quite a challenge for me. I'll win her over. But her brother and I were roommates, and she actually left Oshkosh and went to La Crosse to go to school. And so she would come every other weekend to see her brother, who I was roommates with, and that's how I got to see her. But I was always so busy trying to evangelize the campus and try to save everybody from all the bars that were around Oshkosh, which is a lot of bars in Oshkosh. But so you see that the spiritual character, the inward part, requires a lot of spiritual discernment and objectivity on our part. She was attracted to his reputation and his character. It says, your name is like purified oil, which was a direct reference to Solomon's character of virtue and integrity. Now, all of this flowed from his relationship with God. And I believe his dad was his mentor as well. So how do we discern good character? And this is something you might want to share with those that you know that might be in the stages of beginning to date. How do we discern good character? Number one, their behavior in stressful conditions. How do they act in stressful situations? If you're out with a person, you're dating, you're attracted to this person, you'll find the next time we meet about dating, the primary functions of dating is observation. Observation and edification. That's the primary function or purpose of dating, is observation and edification. Observation is how do they respond to certain situations, and what do they do about building other people up? Are they there to tear people down, to kind of promote themselves? I'm watching. How do I respond or react in various situations? And that's what dating is really all about. And so the woman here, she was attracted to Solomon's name, which was like purified oil. Now, oil comes from olives that are pressed. Okay? So she's saying that his name is like purified oil. And again, name references his character. And so how does a person respond to stress or reacts when things don't go their way? How do they act when money is tight? How do they act when someone rejects or criticizes them? How do they respond? Do they try to get even? Or do they take more of the higher road and say, I'm going to pray for this person? Maybe they just don't fully understand what I'm going through right now. But do they simply mirror the approach of the other person? This is what I'm watching for. How do they respond when they're criticized? How do they respond when money is tight? Again, this is a part of the dating process. I'm observing. And one of the best, even in corporate America, when I was a sales manager, if I was going to hire someone, I would always take them out to lunch. And the primary reason was I wanted to create kind of a comfortable environment, but I wanted to observe how he treated the server. How do they treat the people around them? If he's very rude to the server, chances are I wasn't going to hire this person. So I'm watching. How are they treating other people? And if there's a misstep, maybe if they brought the wrong food or something, I wish I could have talked to the kitchen and say, hey, just do this. I want to see what he's responding, but I didn't. But sometimes it happens where the food wasn't prepared to their liking. How would they respond to that? So I'm watching how they respond in stressful situations. I want to see how they're responding. And that's another thing, even with your pastor search. Take your pastor out. How does he treat people around? Does he make eye contact with other people that's in the restaurant? How does he speak to the server? So these are some little tips that I've learned. This, again, the Song of Solomon is about building relationships, healthy relationships, all the way from the dating to commitment to the marriage, but even life in general. These are some good practical principles that we can learn by observing the people. Because people can always put on a real front, and especially when you get resumes. The resumes can always look good. You can put good ink on paper and make it say anything you want. But in real life, if there's stressful situations, how do they treat, if they are married, how do they treat their spouse? How do they treat their children? We had a missionary one time, and he didn't know that I was on staff. And I was walking through. He was so rude to his wife and his kids. It made me angry. And I went to our lead pastor. I said, we're not supporting these guys in missions. I said their family life is a wreck. The way he treated her and is not healthy. It's not right. So you want to observe, how do they treat other people? And generally the people that are closest to them that they treat the worst, unfortunately. And so again, a person's character is determined a lot by stressful situations. How do they react? Number 2 is the reputations with others. The woman declared, the virgins love you. He had a good reputation. Does the person that you're attracted to have a reputation for obeying God? How do they treat the opposite sex? Would I love to bring this person home to mom and dad? That's the first thing. Would I bring this person home? Would I want to introduce them to my grandparents? Would I want to introduce this person to my church? What's the reputation with other people? It's interesting, and I'm really humbled by what I'm going to share with you, is when I was the regional director for Freedom Life Skills, a ministry based out of Colorado. We had an state office in Green Bay, and they made me the Lakeshore Regional Director. And it's a ministry that helps people to deal with the wounds of their past. It's a ministry. It's a Christian ministry. It's a parachurch, but it helps people to deal with, why do I do the things that I do? Why is my relationships, why aren't they succeeding? And so I put a lot of people through the program from Manitowoc, Sheboygan, Ozaukee County, the whole Lakeshore region. And my pastor, when I'm not pastoring somewhere, the pastor that I submit to, a younger man that I actually helped mentor, he goes, you have quite the reputation. He goes, I can't, hardly anybody in this town that I talk to that doesn't know you. Either you've done their wedding, so I've done a lot of weddings, either you've done their wedding, or you've put them through life skills, or you've put them through Trek. You've been so influential in people's lives to bring emotional health and healing to people. He says, everyone I know knows you, and you have a great reputation. And so we actually got involved in what's it called? The Global Summit, from that Willow Creek used to do. And so they would send you to Atlanta for training and stuff, how to host a global summit, global leadership summit. And so the associate pastor, who's a friend of mine, goes down there to Atlanta. And they randomly just sit around at different places, and the guy starts asking around, hey, where are you from? And the pastor, a friend of mine, says, well, I'm from Sheboygan Falls. The guy at his table says, oh, I know a guy from Wisconsin. His name is Andy Shanholtz. Do you know him? And the guy looks, his eyes got big. He says, how in the world is this possible? In Atlanta, Georgia, from Wisconsin, the guy knew me. So I thought, it's interesting to have a good reputation. Now, a bad reputation will follow you as well. So but reputation with others is very critical, and that's a part of what should be attracting. How do other people view you? Do they view you as someone who is kind, someone who is considerate, someone who is passionate? And then the third one is obedient to authority. How do they respond to authority figures? How do they respond to their own parents? How do they respond to their teachers? How do they respond to law enforcement? How do they respond to your boss? How do they respond to people who are in authority over them? See, God has a chain of command in effect, and we are required to be obedient to those in authority as unto the Lord. It says, the woman explained her darkened skin was a result of obeying her brothers to work in the fields. Again, women in those days prized fair skin because it meant that they were indoor girls, that they were pampered and sheltered. So how do they treat people in authority? You know, I remember my dad on a school, we were not allowed to call our teachers by their first name. You always called them by Mr. and Mrs. I mean, that was, if we called them by their first name, we got reprimanded pretty well by our parents. And I remember when I got saved my senior year in high school, the teacher that oversaw that, he was a Christian, he oversaw the Bible studies that we had in public school, and his Bible study is still going on today, 40-some years later that I started. And so whenever I go back, I get an opportunity to come in. It has to be a Bible study. You know, you're not proselyting, trying to convert, but you're studying Bible. So now they call it a Bible club, but it still meets to this day. And a teacher that oversaw that retired, in fact, bought my grandparents' home in West Virginia. That's called the Shanholtz Farm. And he bought the farm, and I wanted to stop in and see the farm because my dad was born there, and all of his siblings were born there. You know, there were 17 kids born in this farm. And my grandfather built this house for like a retirement for my grandmother and himself. And so this teacher friend bought it. And I remember stopping in, and I called him Mr. Seville. He said, well, you can call me John. I said, no, sir, you're Mr. Seville. I was so indoctrinated to respect authority from what my dad had told me that I was no way I was going to call him by his first name. It was a sign of disrespect in my generation. And so I would not call him by his first name. So again, how do people that you're attracted to, how do they treat people who are in authority? Because if they are disrespectful to people in authority, what are they going to be when you are together? And maybe even after you're married? And will he be abusive? Will he disrespect you? Will he complain about you to other people? See, respect for authority is not someone who complains about them. They simply do what they're told and respect them. Now, again, if something that causes you to sin, you don't do it, okay? But you always respect the office of the position. There are some bad people everywhere, but you always respect the office of the person that's in authority. That's the point I'm making. So how do I respect that position? Now, here's some guidelines to knowing when you're ready to date. How do I know I'm ready to date? That's always a good question. How do we know? See, a person, and catch this, a person is ready to date in my own mind. A person is written, again, this is my feelings, okay? A person is ready to date when they are ready to begin the process of choosing someone to marry, or when they have convictions that will not be compromised. And that's really what it is. My daughter, you know, I let her do things in groups. I would not allow one-on-one. And so she would always do things in groups, and I need to know where they're at, and you know, the time to be back home. And also, the boy had to walk up to the door and not blow the horn of the car. That triggered me. It's a true story. The guy she's married to now happened to be in the back seat. She was actually dating or going out like the guy that was driving this car. And he comes up to the house, blows the horn. I came out of my recliner this high, I jumped, I dragged him through the window of his car. I was going to come down on his head. I mean, that's how angry I was. But I had to catch myself. This is a pastor here about ready to cold cock a minor. Pastor's locked up for knocking down a minor who had no respect for authority. So, and I told him, I said, listen, my daughter is not a piece of meat that you blow the horn, she comes out. A gentleman walks to the door, escorts her to the car, and then walks her back to the door when you come home. That's what I expect from you. And so you need to come in, we need to have a conversation of my expectations to go out with my daughter. And my future son-in-law was sitting in the back seat. And his eyes got this big, because both guys were 6 foot. I mean, her husband is 6. My son-in-law is 6'6". My daughter is 5 foot even. So, but I got this guy almost all the way through the window of his car so fast that he got the message. My daughter is to be treasured because that's how I view her, as my pride and joy. So you treat her with dignity and respect, and that's what I expect from you. And so a person is ready to date when they begin the process of choosing someone to marry, or when their convictions, they are strong enough in their convictions to not compromise due to peer pressure. Now, until you are ready to begin the process of choosing a mate, you'll find it better not to date one person exclusively. This is why I allowed her to do things in groups. Now, there's a really good book by Henry Cloud called How to Find a Date Worth Keeping. So you may want to, if you have someone that's in the process of dating, you may want to get them a copy of that book. So number one, some guidelines to knowing when you're ready to date. Number one, you are ready to date and marry when you have a silhouette in your mind of the kind of guy or girl you will choose to marry, and when you have resolved in your heart that you will not settle for less. Again, don't restrict yourself just to the physical only. Godly character is absolutely essential. That's why there's a 2-tier process to the gift of attraction. Physical and then the godly character component. Both are essential. Number 2, you are ready to date and marry when you do not have to compromise any aspect of your relationship with God in order to be with the person to whom you are attracted. This person is not going to make you compromise your spiritual convictions. In fact, again, a part of dating is the edification. Is this person helping me draw closer to God, or is this person pulling me away from God? That's the thing that part of our observations and edification. What are they doing in my own spiritual journey? Number 3, you are ready to date and marry when you are willing to be single rather than make a bad choice of a marriage partner. I know people that have gotten married because they felt desperate, and that didn't last for them. Or if they did stay together, it was a very unhappy relationship. So if you can come to the point to where you're willing to remain single instead of compromising or settling, then you're ready to date. And number 4, you are ready to date and marry when you are becoming the person that your ideal mate is praying about meeting. Or this is assuming that you're a Christian. You have to make sure that you are becoming an answer to prayer for a seeking Christian person. Am I an answer to prayer, or am I a curse? So that's the guidelines that we see. So from this first 8 verses of Solomon, the attraction, she commented upon how physically, how he looked. She also commented upon his name, his character. And that was also affirmed by the daughters of Jerusalem, or the friends that were there. So that completes our first study. And so what I have here are some questions. Would you guys feel comfortable in getting together and just maybe going through these 5 questions? Use some time. Now, there'll be certain lessons that I will do that will take the whole hour. This one happens to be a little bit shorter. Just want to give you a taste of what this class is like. Darla has the questions she's going to bring to you. And let me read to you what the 5 questions, and if you get through 1 or 2 of them, that's fine. But I think it'd be fun if you just kind of got together in a little circle, keep your social distancing, and just maybe talk about these questions. And let me read to you what these 5 questions are. And again, you may want to just pick what some of these questions are that you want to talk about. The first one is, most marriage, whoops, I'm in the conflict section, we're not there yet. Let me get back here to the first question. Here we go. If you are engaged or married, what attracted you to your future spouse? If you're single, what do you consider attractive? So it might be fun just to get to know each other a little bit. what attracted you to the person? Was there something physical? Was there a character thing that you really liked? And I mentioned I found I loved my wife's eyes, and I thought she was shapely. And when we got married, she was very, very attractive. But what really attracted me to her more than anything was her compassion. She was so compassionate towards hurting people. And also, she has the greatest sense of humor of any person that I know. And when you get older, sense of humor goes a long ways. We laugh with each other, not at each other. And so that's a key. You don't want to laugh at them, you want to laugh with them. And so my wife and I have a great sense of humor. I always tell her she has the spiritual gift of harassment. I mean, if I would say some things to people that she said, I'd be punched in the face. But she gets away with it, you know. But that's a gift. And she says she's a teaser, but she's really funny. And I love her sense of humor. Number 2, according to these first 8 verses, what attracts this man to this woman, and what attracts her to Solomon? And number 3, how does our society determine preparedness for marriage? From what you learned in this session, when is someone ready to get married? And number 4, we discover the woman working in the vineyards in verses 5 through 6. Why is this significant? What traits are revealed about her character about working in the vineyard? And then number 5, why is mutual respect such a vital key to attraction? So Dan, if you want to go ahead and you can probably turn me off. I want to thank you all for coming. And so next month, the third Wednesday, we'll pick up on dating.